We are continuing on in the book of The Perfect Team. You may be wondering why I'm reading from a book when people can read for themselves. The truth is that keeping literature alive, whether you read it on your own or you catch a few glimpses here and there of what the secret team is about, it's important that this work in particular stay prominent and alive, because the end of the world is here. I mean, we're on the trajectory for it, right? And no one's doing anything about it except for me and some, I call our team the perfect team. But let's get started here. So this is the book, Secret Team, a very, what is the word? It's like where they ban the book. But this book was written by a CIA agent who lived in there, lived in the CIA and knows the CIA, and wrote this book and told us that John F. Kennedy was murdered by the government. So the government is evil. It's all agenda-based movement of information. All right. Chapter 17, Mission Astray Soviet Gamemanship. High over eastern Turkey, the big plane tossed fitfully in the turbulent air. Scattered snow-white cloud formations billowed above to 35 and 40,000 feet. In the brilliant sunlight and clear air between the clouds, the crew could see the distant shores at Lake Van. Lake Van, they would turn to the southeast to cross near Lake Urmia and then on to Tehran. All was going well, and they expected to be in Tehran on schedule, or perhaps a little early. The navigator was new to this remote area of the world, but he had noted that the winds were picking up. He had alerted the pilot and watched for the turn at Lake Van. You know, if you miss it, we'll be in Russia. 5 men were up front in the pilot's compartment, and the others were in the empty cabin, relaxing. One young crew member, enjoying his first visit to the Near East, was taking pictures out of the right side of the plane. He noted one particularly high peak rising all by itself from the knot of mountains around it. The plane was cruising at about 19,000 feet, yet his lone majestic peak seemed almost to reach the altitude. Then it was lost from sight because of the cloud, and he waited for the next chance to take another picture. In front of them, the pilot saw that they were getting quite close to the big lake, and he was preparing to turn as soon as he reached its near corner. On his highly classified mission, none of them wanted to take any chances of being too close to the Soviet Union. If what was in heavy briefcases in a tail compartment of the plane ever fell into the hands of the Soviets, the work of many years with the U-2 in the Near East would be exposed, and the participation of those friendly northern tier countries would be compromised. As Lake Van dipped under the nose of the big transport, the pilot took the plane off of autopilot, gently banked it to the right, and set a course along the international airway for Tehran, which should have brought him just to the east of Lake Urmia. As he was busy realigning the autopilot, he noticed far ahead, under the base of the cumulus clouds, they looked to be the shore of Lake Urmia, just about where it should be, slightly to his left. Still thinking of the Soviet Union, he gave the knobs that controlled the autopilot on extra twist to bring the big bird much more into the safe side. I have to digress for a moment, thinking about Sherpia, the leader of some state who is bad-mouthing Southwest. Southwest is the worker of the CIA. And they're throwing CIA under the bus for political purposes. And that's what you get for working with the Democratic Party, CIA. The young airman in the rear of the plane was able to get another good view of the mountain now, off to the right, and was preparing to shoot another picture when he saw the first MiG coming up fast on their wingtip. When he saw another MiG and the undeniable red star on the big high slab tail, which is a distinguishing feature of the MiG. He dashed up the cockpit and called to the pilot. At about the time they all could hear the tut-tut-tut rapid fire of the MiG's cannon. With MiGs riding just off the right wing tip, the pilot had no choice but to detach the autopilot and veer slightly to the left. Then his co-pilot noticed the Russian pilot motioning them downward. He told the pilot, who cut the power a little and continued to blank left. In this maneuver, they began into a nearby cloud. The whole plane shuddered, and the men in the cabin saw the plane inboard engine burst into flames. I do believe that plane, that there's a couple things. There's a turbulent concern on the way to Hawaii. That was planned by the government. And then the one they show on TV where the wings were like this, I also do believe that was planned also. Another MiG flying just under his belly had given them a convincing burst of fire in the left engine nacelle. Without waiting, 5 of the 9 men on board donned parachutes, jettisoned the big main door as soon as the pilot decompassed the cabin air pressure and bailed out. All of these men landed safely but were burned by flying droplets of molten metal coming from the burning engine. The other 4 men had no choice but to stay with the plane, with the MiGs flying only a few feet off their wingtips. They gently let the burning plane settle toward the fields below. It was then that the pilot noted a small, unfinished airstrip in the farmland. He leveled off and eased that plane toward the only safe haven he could see. As he approached this small landing strip, he noticed that the grass was leaning toward his line of flight, and that wind and the few small trees indicated that it would be landing downward. This meant a fast landing on a small strip, but he did not dare to pull the plane up and try again. He could see the flames and the white-hot inboard engine, and he knew that the wing would fold up and drop off in a few more minutes. He cut his power, dropped the gear, and dropped full flaps as fast as he could, and drove the big plane into the ground, planning to bring it to a halt with brakes and luck. The plane stopped skidding far out of the field beyond the end of the unfinished runway. It had been a rough landing, but they were on the ground. Now they had to get out of the plane right away because of the tailwind. The fire around the engines was blowing forward and had begun to engulf the entire wing and cockpit area in billowing smoke. The fuel tanks in the outer wing would be the next to go, and that would be some explosion. The 4 men on the plane didn't wait to put the ladder down from the cabin doorway, which was about 9 feet into the air. They swung from the emergency rope and slid it to the ground, then ran away from the plane as fast as they could. As they ran, they saw smoke billowing above the plane. The MiGs swirled above them, as much as to say, "Stand where you are. We're watching." Just as they stopped running, they saw that there were 5 parachutes had landed or settled to the earth, and a few miles away, all 9 men had landed. All 9 wondered where they were, and Washington had been just home for about an hour and had started a charcoal fire in the backyard. The steaks were ready, and my wife and I were finishing a drink on the patio when the telephone rang. My young daughter answered the phone and said, "Mr. White wants to speak to you, Daddy." I picked up the phone, and Mr. White turned out to be General Thomas White, then the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. He did not want to discuss the subject on the phone, but I suggested I go directly to Alan Dulles' house and do whatever I could to help him with the problem that had arisen. In a few minutes, I was on the way to Dulles' home. I pulled into the driveway before dark, and I walked through the house to his study. I noted 4 men finishing a tennis match on the court in the rear of the house. Alan Dulles had a V-neck tennis sweater with white tennis shorts and peaked hat. He quickly introduced me to Dick Bissell and some of the others who were there, and then began to tell me about their problem. American newsmen in Moscow had been saying that the USAF aircraft was down somewhere in the Soviet Union. This report had been coming in from Moscow for more than 18 hours. That means they're evil. No one had been able to confirm or deny it. The president wanted an answer one way or the other without fail. A check of all Air Force aircraft showed that none were missing and that none were known to be anywhere near the Soviet Union. The other services and all other operators of large transport aircraft that might have been in the area were checked. No aircraft were missing. Quiet requests had been made to the CIA station chiefs in other countries to see if there might have been foreign plane of the U.S.-made type that could have gone down the Soviet Union. For 18 hours, all of these checks had proved to be fruitless. Damn. There's some major duty doo-doo here. Yet the story from Moscow persisted. It was apparent that the Russian knew more than they had released, and they were letting someone strew over the problem. A picture of 4-engine aircraft were given to the press and burning in the last stages of destruction. About all that was left was a towering tail section. Since the wind had blown from the car, the fire had burned in the front of the wings where the fuel cells were located and had left no more than the high tail section, which this tail section had all the stuff in it. This gave little to work on, yet it was quite obvious that the tail of the DC-6, or the military C-118, after I talked with them for a while and listened to all of the news they had, I excused myself and went to the Pentagon. In my office there with the top secret safe with a special card file on a great number of the 7,000 odd men who worked with me all over the world in special activities that were generally related to the support of the CIA. It consisted of a code of names, numbers, and other information that was indispensable. I took the box of cards and went down to the basement of the Pentagon to the Air Force Command Post. This is one of the finest communication centers in the world. The duty officer authorized me to enter and take over one of the telephone positions there on a matter of urgency. In a few minutes, I had reached the home of Germany of an Air Force officer who might be able to tell me about a C-118 aircraft that was not in the Air Force inventory and which might be the one that was missing. The plane I was looking for was one that belonged to the CIA itself and one of two considered to be Mr. Dulles' personal planes. I had called this officer's home in Germany by private commercial lines by bypass the military center in Frankfurt. There would be time for them later. It was about 4 a.m. then in Wiesbaden when the phone was answered by the housekeeper. The officer was not home. I asked where he was and learned simply that he'd gone on a flight. That was part of the answer I needed. I called another Air Force officer who was a cover type. He told me that the plane was away on a trip. I stopped him there and asked him to go immediately to headquarters and to call me from there on a secure scrambler telephone. About 20 minutes later, the security phone rang, and he told me that the General Cabell and Director of Central Intelligence had arrived in Germany a few days earlier in the special C-118. He had authorized a CIA Air Force crew to take the plane in a very highly classified and important flight to Tehran and Pakistan. Cabell had gone on to England in a smaller plane with the 9 agency men, had taken the big plane to Cyprus, then to Adana, Turkey, and thence to Tehran. He was advised to get the names of the 9 men while I involved Adana. Whatever this is evil as shit. They were giving something to somebody. The next call was to the duty officer at Adana. He asked to check the records there for the CIA C-118. After a few moments, he said that no C-118 had come through Adana on the day in question. He was asked to check again and to query the operations office people, even if he had to wake them up one at a time. The plane must have gone through there. Fortunately, he started his search by talking with the weatherman on duty. He had been on duty with the C-118 and left Adana. The meteorologist remembered the crew and the plane. I feel like I'm dying. Am I dying? Do I look like I'm dying? Still, they had Still, they find no record of the flight. Finally, the duty officer checked the on-duty operations officer to see if perhaps he had held out the clearance papers for that flight. This did the trick. A few minutes after I had gotten to the complete crew list from the contact in Germany, a call from Adana came in, stating that the pilot of C-118 had told the operations officer not to file the clearance he had made, but to hold it. This was done frequently on such black flights, and it accounted for why no one had missed the plane. Ordinarily, Any overdue Air Force aircraft would be the subject of an alarm and search within 1 hour after its last reported position. The people at Adana did not know where the plane was going, and the people at Tehran did not know what it was expected. So once the plane, this plane of all planes had taken off, no one had monitored the flight at all. Its singular disappearance had gone completely unnoticed, even to the event that it was not included on the Air Force master inventory or on the DoD master list of all military aircraft. Having pieced this much together, I called Alan Dulles on the direct line to his home and told him that the plane we were looking for was General Cabell's plane, but that Cabell was not aboard. Within minutes, even at that hour, he was on the phone to his brother, who had turned past the word onto the White House. After a few hours' rest, I drove back into town and stopped at Alan Dulles' house, picked him up, and went to Foster Dulles' house, where we met the Secretary of Defense. At the time, Neil McElroy and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Thomas White, the CIA had confirmed that 9 men were on the plane, that it had left Adana for Tehran, and the men had with them aboard the plane most highly classified material in heavy briefcases. There was nothing to do but announce that the military transport aircraft on the routine trip had been blown off course on its way from Adana, Turkey, en route to Tehran, and that it had landed in the Soviet Union south of Baku. At that time, we knew no more than that, and we did not know that the plane had been shot down. The Secretary of State picked up the direct telephone to the White House and spoke with the president. The official version of the story was released with the hope that there would be no necessity to elaborate further. However, this would depend upon the identification carried by the crew members and on whether or not the classified material and other interns that might have identified the CIA would be uncovered. It might not long before the Russians released the story that the big plane had violated its airspace and that MiG fighters had forced it down as an attempted escape maneuver by firing a warning burst into the left wing. What we did not know at the time was that the pilot and other crew members had mistaken Lake Sevan for Lake Van. This meant that a greater than expected tailwind had blown them off course and to the left, and at the same time had put them ahead of schedule. Because of the clouds, they missed Lake Van, and with Lake Sevan in sight, they felt no concern. They were sure that they were on the right course. The CIA had utilized a crew for this flight who did not know the area well, and confusion is not uncommon for a new crew in a strange place. Then with Lake Sevan is their mistaken turning point where they did not see water ahead, which looked like Lake Urmia. Not being familiar with Lake Urmia, or larger lake, they mistook the distant shoreline for the Caspian Sea for Lake Urmia and thought all is well. Actually, the wind-blown course, they were well inside the Soviet border, somewhat south of Baku. The key to their mistake was discovered later when all the crewmen were questioned, and the young airman in the cabin who had been taking pictures told us about the huge mountain off to their right. That was Mount Ararat, over 16,000 feet in altitude, and the highest peak in the area. Mount Ararat should have been far on the left, and they should have turned to the southeast before they ever got near Ararat. When the airman revealed that they had photographed Mount Ararat through the right window looking to the south before their turn, and then had seen it again through the same right window after the turn, thus to the east, it became indisputable clear that the plane had passed north and then well into the east of Mount Ararat. This is far, of course, and over Soviet territory. Another thing we did not know was that the men in their parachutes were descending. They all realized they were carrying considerable identification, including reference to the USAF cover unit that might have compromised them. So they began to clean out their pockets and tear up all they could while going down. Later, they learned the Russian farmers noticed this hail of bits of pieces of paper, and that the local police had rounded up scores of people, located most of the evidence, and reassembled it during the captivity. Another thing that became evident from the selected pictures that Russians chose to release was that the fact that the C-118 did not burn completely. The part that remained after the tailwind landing was the entire rear of the plane, where the classified briefcases were. Tests on such briefcases had shown that they were sustained considerable heat and some flames without appreciably damaging the documents inside, and the chances were very good that the entire classified cargo had been removed intact. This may have saved the men from lengthy captivity, knowing that they were doing nothing more than transporting briefcases, and that most likely they were little more than a crew and not true agents. The Soviets may have reasoned that it would better to release the men early. That would imply that they really believed the men were simply transport crewmen, and it would lead us to attempt to find out how much the Russians might have gained through the unscheduled gratuity of the briefcases. The men were held for 9 days, and during this time they were questioned continually. The Russians learned all they needed to know and then let the crew go without too much delay. One episode stands out clearly and supports the idea that they knew quite well exactly what they had captured aboard was an Air Force colonel and the senior officer of the U.S. Air Force cover unit in Wiesbaden, Germany. He was a real Air Force officer, and his cover assignment was deep, but not so deep that he would have had great value to the Russians. However, they did not wish to miss any chances. After a few days in Baku, the Russians approached the colonel and told him that since he was the senior officer and since it had become obvious to them that they were simply the commander of transport unit, his cover story, they saw no need to have him attend the strenuous interrogations in which the other men were involved. In fact, they suggested that he might enjoy a few days fishing on the Caspian. They also told him that they had located a teacher who happened to be there on his vacation and that this teacher could speak English. The colonel accepted this offer, and for several days he joined the male teacher on hiking and fishing trips. During this time, they talked a lot about the U.S. It seemed that the teacher had been in Washington during World War II, and that he had been a member of the Russian Lend-Lease staff. The teacher was able to lead the conversation into many fields, and the colonel thought it best to speak unrestrainedly in order to establish a comfortable relationship that might help all of them to gain their release. However, upon retrospection, the colonel did realize that the teacher seemed to have most excellent insight into American policies and practices, but in his zeal to win his cooperation, the colonel tried to answer what seemed to be simple questions, even when they led to times into some areas that put a little pressure on secrecy. When the men were released 9 days after they had been shot down, a special team had been sent to the Iranian-Soviet border to provide transportation to get them back to Germany without delay. In Germany, the men went through lengthy interrogations designed to be somewhat superficial so that they might let their guard down. Then, when they were flown to the U.S., they were put through a program of intense and highly professional interrogation by teams of well-trained FBI and CIA. I'll be honest, they're not that well-trained. I'm like better trained than they are. And military men, it was the Washington debriefing that uncovered the Mount Ararat, fixed the location of the briefcases, and the fact they're bulliers is what they are. The fact that they must probably were not destroyed, and the debriefing also developed the school teacher angle further. By about the 5th day of debriefing, the combined FBI and CIA team was able to lay a set of pictures on the table before the colonel, and with apparent ease show him several good pictures of the school teacher. This vacationing school teacher was none other than one of the top intelligence men of the Soviet Union. He had been with the Russian staff in Washington during the Lend-Lease period in World War II. The very fact that this man himself participated in the mild interrogation on the shores of the Caspian made it quite clear that the Russians had found out that they had made a big catch in the capture of this one plane. This whole incident in some way presaged the U-2 affair and in some ways offered clues to other events that followed. The CIA was getting to the point where it took operational matters into its own hands. There were no reason whatsoever why this highly specialized and sanitized C-118 should have been used on a mission close to the Soviet border. Any Air Force aircraft could have been used. Certainly the Russians combed the remains of the plane and found a number of odd features, among them totally unsanitized and unmarked component parts. There's no reason whatsoever to utilize an inexperienced CIA crew on this flight when the Air Force had a number of crews that were familiar with the Gordian Knot area of remote Turkey, actually. There is an effective radio beacon homer on the southern tip of Lake Van, and an inexperienced crew would have used it properly. For example, a navigator on the CIA crew had not been in this area before, and another navigator who was with him had not been there for a long time. Headed by the name same James McCord, later to gain notoriety in the 1972 Watergate affair, industrial components were marked with special number codes and other identifying inscriptions, and thorough intelligence systems classified these things and can gain considerable information from such data. Perhaps the most damaging oversight, which must have confirmed for the Russians that they had caught a pretty special breed of fish, was that the CIA was unnecessary secrecy with respect to flight clearances of the plane. There was no good reason why the plane, which looked just like a regular Air Force plane, should not have used the customary landing and takeoff clearances that all Air Force aircraft use the world over. This would have assured that the flight would have been monitored. Under such regulations, the Air Force would have noted that the silence of the plane within 30 minutes, and in any case within 1 hour after its last contact with a ground station. This is a standard procedure. Had this been done, a search would have been started right away. Then the Secretary of State and the President would not have had to deny that a plane was missing for a full 18 hours, while the Russians knew all this, that exactly what had been taken of. They had the men, the plane, and the briefcases. It might be added that a normal part of the Air Force clearance requires confirmation that the crew is competent and has been over the route recently. Failure of this entire U.S. government to respond to the reported loss of the aircraft certainly signaled to the Russians that this plane must have been in a special mission if nothing else did. 1 year later, this same thing happened when the U-2 was lost. At first, the United States did not know just where the U-2 had been lost. Then, when it was realized that it had been down in Russia, it was assumed that the pilot was dead. To a cover story, it was used only to have Khrushchev blow it up when he surfaced a live pilot and a nearly whole aircraft, both in the Soviet hands. It goes without saying that the CIA compounded the problems of the incident by permitting a most highly secret cargo to be entrusted to this plane and crew when it could have set up a more secure and less casual means of transportation, even if it had used a normal commercial air carrier. Such disregard for real professionalism in favor of growing dependence upon its newfound strength, independence, and size became more marked as the years passed. That one drained me. That one's it for tonight because that one was deep. There's something really bad doo-doo with that one. I'm like so sick of this shit, man. You guys are something else. This is so shit. We got 1, 2. We got 4 chapters left, I think. Maybe not. We got 7 chapters. They're little chapters. So most of them are little chapters. We got this much of the book left to go. Can you believe we've read all this? Have you ever read a book like this before, Gary? I'm being serious. Because these kind of books are not easy to read. They're like kind of boring. We're committed to finishing it, Colonel. I'm like beat. Okay, that's it.